welcome everyone to this very special and important global discussion forum. This is the 7th global discussion forum that we have had, and probably one of our most important. We're going to be discussing mass immigration and how to deal with it. And on this forum, we have some special guests. Firstly, let's bring on our chairman of the Global Discussion Forum to introduce our guest. Now, the last time he was on GB News, he got bumped for just a little moment in history. It was when Donald Trump and JD Vance were hosting Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office. And Lee, you were bumped aside for that. So hopefully we can give you more time to speak to today, the chairman of the Global Discussion Forum, Lee Evans. Welcome.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for chairing us. Welcome, everybody. This is the 7th Global Discussion Forum organised by Brexit Facts for EU, which is, for those who don't know, the most prolific researcher and publisher in the world for the last 10 years on matters of the independence of the UK and specifically relating to things like Brexit and the European Union. This 7th Global Discussion Forum is on a topic which I think is relevant all the way around the world, and that is mass immigration and how to deal with it. It's a co-production between Facts for EU, cibuk UK, and for those that don't know, the Campaign for Independent Britain is the oldest established such body, having been going since 1969, which is pretty impressive. And on the other side of the world, it's also co-produced by Australians for Better Government, which campaigns for, well, exactly what it says on the tin, Better Government for Australians. And also Commanding the Narrative, which is an excellent podcast, which I can recommend, that deals with a lot of very topical issues. So look that up, Commanding the Narrative. We are at Global Discussion Forum, a bastion for free expression, freedom of thought, free expression, free speech, which is just as well when you consider the man that I'm about to introduce you all to. His name is Senator Malcolm Roberts. He's a senator from a federal senator from Queensland. And here is where we get it interesting, because this is a global event. I need to explain to the British audience that there's something rather unusual about the senator, and that is that he hasn't spent his entire life in politics, unlike most of the MPs that we have in Parliament these days. He started life in the mining industry, and he rose to become the chief mining engineer of a major mine in Queensland. And so, although he's a politician, he's had a real job before that. And it kind of shows really in the way he talks. He's a prominent Conservative politician in Australia. I think it's very fair to say. He advocates migration control, very relevant to what we're talking about today. For those that are interested, he's also interested in limited government, individual freedom, and traditional values. He's also a climate change skeptic, and he's advocated Australia exiting, Auxexit, I think he calls it, exiting organisations such as the United Nations, which might resonate with many countries around the world. Today, though, he's talking to us about immigration, and after his keynote address, then you'll have an opportunity to ask him questions in the panel discussion that he's kindly agreed to stay on for after this. You can keep your questions short. Stephen will be managing everything from there on in. So, Senator, welcome to the Global Discussion Forum, and it's now over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. And thank you to everyone involved in organising it. This is a wonderful discussion to have. I'm going to start with something you might not expect. I love humans. I absolutely love humans. I'm very, very proud of our species. And because the greatest problem we face is the anti-human myth, and I'll come back to that. I was born in India. My dad was a migrant from Wales, your country, Britain. And I want to acknowledge migrants right from the start, because Australia has been built on migrants, but we have too many of them at the moment. Queensland, the state I represent in federal parliament, should be the world's wealthiest state. It is not. We have people who are homeless in record numbers. sleeping under bridges, sleeping in cars, working families, mums and dads coming home to their kids in their car, sleeping in the night. I don't know where they toilet and where they go for a shower. Massive immigration, out of control immigration, is causing a homelessness crisis in our country. It's driving up the cost of living, and it's overwhelming the infrastructure that hasn't been built for decades now. We have record immigration. We have 2.5, we have a population of 27 million people in this country. We've grown phenomenally in the last few years, and we have 2.5 million people on temporary work visas. That's 10% of the population. We have 750,000 people coming into the country on migrant visas. That is just inexplicable. It's catastrophic. We also have whoops, we nearly have a wreck in the studio here. We also have students that are in around about 600,000 international students in the country, which is well above the 100,000 beds that we have for them. We also have students exploiting the system from overseas and sending $11.1 billion off overseas back to their families. This record immigration of 750,000 people in each of the last 2 years has been built on the backs of previous prime ministers. John Howard was our supposedly conservative prime minister back in 1996 to 2007. He doubled the immigration in his term. He started massive immigration, and everyone since then has increased it. The current prime minister is hiding a per capita recession. That's what he's using massive immigration for, to hide a per capita recession. If it hadn't been for the extra immigrants he'd brought into the country in the last couple of years, we would be in recession. He'd be tarnished with the brush of causing that recession. So what's happened so far is that I've had I'm blessed with having wonderful staff, and one in particular, a young man, only in his mid-20s, has been doing the research for me on housing and immigration, and the numbers have been frightening. We've been pushing those numbers out. We've also got other staff who have been basing everything on that and pushing that out, as well as the other topics we cover. Now, as a result of the pressure we have pushed from our office and the fact that I'm ably supported by the leader of my party, Pauline Hanson, who's always been very strong on immigration, the Uni Party, the Liberal and Labor, their policies are almost identical, are now offering empty platitudes. They've recognised that we are resonating with the people, because people are tired of putting up with massive, catastrophic immigration. So the key issue for us is to educate the people. We don't get much mouthpiece media, globalist media, the Big Brother media. So we have to do that through speeches in the Senate, through social media. But the Uni Party is copying us. They're now talking about, but giving us vague numbers, targets on reducing immigration, reducing overseas students, eliminating foreign ownership for 2 years based upon just on new homes. So we're biting into the agenda. I'm keeping an eye on the time here. There are two factors in immigration. The first is quantity, numbers, the number of people. That's already catastrophic in our country. We haven't got the resources nor the services to be able to withstand it, and it's driving up inflation. The second, arguably as important or more important, is the quality of the immigrants, the fit, the culture, their compliance with, or their willingness to assimilate into our culture, comply with our laws, meet our values, plus the skills people bring, whether or not they can immediately be put to work and contribute to our society. And so, unfortunately, in all those things, we are bringing in people who do not fit the bill. The culture's importance is extremely important. Culture, as people know in companies and organisations, football clubs, sporting clubs, social clubs, drives safety, drives quality, drives harmony, drives productivity, drives security. It is absolutely essential. And we are seeing a push to destroy our culture. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Government has three roles, as I see it: protect life, protect property, protect freedom. That's all it has to do, and get the hell out of everything else. In a representative democracy, the Member of Parliament's role is to serve the people and serve the national interest. That is abundantly clear in what I say and what I do. I want to make it clear that I believe humans get on well with each other, nationality, regardless of nationality, religions, races, professions. The uniculture nations are the most harmonious. Japan, Korea, they're very big traders, very respectful in their dealings with other nationalities, other religions, other races. So there's nothing wrong with humans. But the second agenda is the global governance issue that's being pushed by a few elitist families in senior positions in the UN, or represented by senior people in the UN World Economic Forum. Their goal is to smash borders, and they do that by smashing cultures and sending people over borders illegally. The greatest problem is the anti-human myth. I'm very, very proud of our species. Humans are wonderful. Sure, we have had our mass murderers and our killers and our butchers like Hitler and Stalin and so on, Pol Pot and Chairman Mao. But the vast majority of humans actually care enormously. So I'd like to talk more about that later, but I'm running out of time. I've come up to 6 minutes. So I'll just say that the core problem is members of parliament not serving the people, not serving the people in the national interest. And the solution is to elect people who will.
That's great. Thank you very much, Senator Roberts. Or can I call you Malcolm?
Sure.
Oh, you can call me Lee then. We're quite a friendly bunch, a bit like you Australians. So that's excellent. Thank you very much for addressing us, and you'll have a chance to say some more in the panel discussion, where I'm absolutely no doubt you're going to be asked lots of questions. Next, we are lucky enough to have, would you believe, another politician who's actually led a life outside of politics. And for those that weren't with us when I was talking about this in introducing Senator Roberts, he also has that distinction. And I don't know about the Australian Parliament, but in the UK, that's a rarity now that we have politicians that have worked outside the world of politics. So I want to introduce to you a good friend, the Right Honourable Sir John Redwood. He'll be known to, I'm sure, all of our British viewers. He was the Chief Policy Advisor to Margaret Thatcher at a very young age. He's a former single market minister, single market meaning the EU single market, when we were a member for so many years, and a former Secretary of State. He's now carrying on, having stepped down from Parliament before the election that we had in July last year. He decided to retire then. Pleased to say that he's carrying on. He's now a very popular political commentator. So he's had experience as a chairman of a PLC company and others. I want to mention one thing when it comes to the man's intelligence. He is a distinguished fellow of All Souls, Oxford. And I can tell you, you don't get much more distinguished than that. So we're very lucky to have him here today. On economics, it is sometimes said about Sir John, particularly by me, that he is the best Chancellor of the Exchequer that we never had. Okay. And judging from the performance of our current Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, that may bring a little smile to the face of some of our British viewers. But in any case, he's a very stimulating speaker, and he's going to talk to us about immigration today. So, John, welcome to the Global Discussion Forum, and over to you.
Lee, thank you very much. Lee Evans is a tower of strength, incredibly hardworking. I love having the opportunity to collaborate with Lee, and I'm delighted with his venture to take our message globally and find we have so many friends, people of common interest in Australia and elsewhere. We all now have electorates that are telling one thing to their governments in Europe and in Australia. Migration is far too large. People do not think we can continue to offer decent homes, decent circumstances to assimilate the large numbers coming in. As the Senator has rightly said, we who've spent time in politics, we like people, we want to help people, we wouldn't go into it if we didn't. But you can have too many people all in one go. And those of us who were representing constituencies could see the impact excessive migration was having on services, on housing, on the provision of the public goods. So I took up two main arguments that the global elite and the UK Treasury were using to defend this idea that we could only run our economies if we invited in a large number of people to take low-paid jobs in our country. The first argument the Treasury put was that we needed economic growth and that if we had more low-paid people coming into jobs, there would be extra growth. Well, of course there would be extra growth. But what they didn't tell us was that by definition, we would have a fall in per capita growth. Because if you're inviting people in at the bottom end on very low wages, and you don't have to top them up with benefits and other subsidies, the GDP per head is bound to fall. What we need is growth that promotes smarter working, higher productivity, better jobs, better paid jobs for people already living here. And that is the way you get the kind of growth that people want. We want per capita growth. We want people to be better off. We want machines to take more of the strain of the not very exciting things to do. And we want a better trained and better motivated workforce. The second bad argument that the Treasury put forward in the UK, was simply wrong, was to say that people brought into low-paid jobs would make a net contribution to public finances. Well, of course, they don't. The Treasury pointed out that they would pay a little bit of national insurance, a little bit of income tax, a little bit of VAT. But you had to put against that the fact that there was a huge strain placed on the public finances to make proper provision for them. If we invite an extra one person into the United Kingdom, we can probably find a flat that's already built. We can probably find a doctor's surgery that could accommodate them on their list. We can probably link them up to existing water and electricity supply. If we invite in 750,000 extra people, as we have done for the last couple of years in each year, there is no way that you have all that provision. You have to go out and build flats or houses for them to live in. You need to build extra reservoirs. You need to put extra pipes in the ground. You need to build extra power stations. You haven't suddenly got spare capacity to accommodate 750,000 people extra every year over a sustained long period, as the UK has now been experiencing. And all that comes with a cost. And as they are on low pay, they won't be able to pay for all that. It will need to be subsidized one way or another. Now, when Angela Merkel decided to let in 1 million plus people to Germany in the middle of the last decade, the Germans got rather worried about the pace and whether they could make the decent provision. And so Germany started to push back a bit and say to the rest of the EU, you other countries in the EU have got to take your share of the many migrants coming across the common EU border. And the EU officials got behind her for a bit, and they did a calculation, and they said that if another country didn't want to take its fair share of people coming into the EU, they needed to pay €250,000 in respect of every migrant they wouldn't take, because that was the capital setup cost and the early year subsidy cost of a new migrant coming into a rich country like Germany or France. And that was 10 years ago. I was willing to accept that figure. I did a few back-of-the-envelope calculations on what the cost would be in Britain. And if you want to set people up, often they want to come to London, of course. You've got very dear housing to provide. You've got all these extra services to provide. You need to hire more doctors and nurses and more teachers for the public services. You need to put in more broadband. So I think 250,000 was a perfectly reasonable estimate. And it was that 250,000 that the UK Treasury and the other globalist advisors just wouldn't accept, although their own EU had worked out such a helpful figure. So what do we do about this? Because obviously we need to control migration. Well, in the United Kingdom, there's been most emphasis on illegals coming across the channel in small boats. Everybody wants to stop that. It's proving to be extremely difficult. There are more things that could be done in terms of the legal framework and the policing to do it. But it's a very small part of the total problem. So maybe 30,000 out of 750,000 net migrants. And the point about the others is they're not all legal, because what happens is that the others, many of them come in by legal routes. So they come in with a student visa or a temporary work visa or a visitor visa, and then they overstay. So they become illegals almost invisibly. And it's the feebleness of the British state in not keeping control of where they are, who they are, what their address is, what their contact number is, and not willing to go and say to them, your visa has now expired, we're not about to renew it, will you kindly leave, that has led to a much bigger surge of illegal migration into the United Kingdom than is apparent if you just concentrate on the small boats. So by way of just a few remarks for the panel, my conclusion is this, that we can change law codes, we can do better follow-up, we can do better policing, that we need to concentrate on returning people who may have come legally but have become illegal, as well as do more to control the small boats. But above all, what we need to do, all of us of goodwill and common sense, is win these two key arguments, that it doesn't make the country richer, and it does impose a huge public sector bill on the state if you invite in too many people all in one go. So don't issue all those visas, get on with the more exciting job of training, encouraging and incentivizing the many people in my country and probably in Australia who aren't working but are of working age and with the right support could take those jobs instead of having low-paid migrants coming in.
Excellent. Thank you. Another splendid keynote speech from Sir John Redwood, following on from Senator Malcolm Roberts, who gave a wonderful and very interesting, stimulating speech. I'm sure he's going to get a lot of questions very shortly. Just picking up, John, very briefly on your point about GDP per capita, and you were speculating on the situation in Australia. Well, you know what I'm like about facts, and I went to look at the Australian's equivalent of the Office for National Statistics, which we have in the UK. I forget what it's called now, but anyway, I looked up the official before this, and GDP per capita in Australia in the last year, for which figures are available, fell by 1.5%. That's pretty significant. So maybe we'll come back to that. So next, Robert Bates, welcome to the Global Discussion Forum, and thank you very much for joining us. Rob is the founder and director of the Centre for Migration Control. He's highly knowledgeable on the subject of immigration, particularly on all the factual side of it. He's got his grip around the numbers of all of that. So Rob is going to give us a short summary, a very short summary because we're running over. And then, in common with all of our speakers, he's very kindly agreed to join our expert panel. And you'll have the chance to ask him some more questions where he can expand. So, Rob, welcome to the Global Discussion Forum. And if you can just give us a very few minutes, if you will, just your take on where things are at the moment, UK, and whether you want to comment more broadly than that. Thank you. Rob, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Ben, for organising. It's great to be alongside such eminent guests. Yeah, so I think the situation in the UK when it comes to legal migration is fast approaching what I think you could accurately describe as a crisis. If you look at the figures in most recent years, you can see that the average net migration is around about 750,000. If you take the last few years, it's been between 1 million and 500,000. It now looks, with 2024 figures having come out, that it will settle at around about 500,000 per year. I think it's important to realise that those individuals coming into the country are primarily not coming for work reasons. Around about 22% of visas that are awarded each year are to individuals on a work visa. The rest are made up of students, dependents, family members, asylum seekers, and so forth. I think then, if we really want to understand the economic consequences of mass migration and what it's actually doing to British productivity and tax receipts, we need to look at the salaries that those individuals coming in on work visas are actually entering in. In 2018, the Migration Advisory Committee commissioned a report which said that if a migrant is going to be making a positive contribution, a net positive contribution to the Treasury. They needed to be earning around about £38,000 a year, and that's to take into consideration the outlays that are required to boost expenditure on capital and police and social security and so forth. In 2023, 70% of individuals coming in on a work visa weren't earning that amount, which means that we actually only had 30% of individuals entering to work actually being viable, positive economic prospects. So I think that really sets out perhaps why we're in a bit of a GDP per capita recession. 6 of the last 8 quarters we've seen GDP per capita in the UK decline. We then also need to take into account the fact that there are huge numbers, or there have been until very recently. The previous Conservative government amended the rules that have brought down the numbers considerably. There have been a huge number of dependents that have been allowed in during this time. Dependents come in with no real obligation to work. They are primarily made up of adults, but about 49% of those are children. And obviously the fact that these individuals, these adults in particular, are not coming into work imposes huge fiscal costs. In the last few years, we've seen 500,000 individuals coming in as dependents. If you then take OBR, which is the UK's economic kind of forecaster, although I think forecast is probably stretching it given the quality of some of their output, you can kind of roughly calculate the cost that these individuals will be imposing on us over the next few years, and it roughly equals out at about £35 billion, which is a huge number that effectively means that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of individuals in the UK will having to be paying income tax exclusively to cover this bill. Now,
Rob, sorry, that's a hell of a figure that you've just given us there. Maybe that's a good point to pause and pick that up in the panel discussion. I can't believe that figure, and I'm sure people will want to know where that comes from and more about it. Apologies, Rob, but we're very keen to get the 3 panel members together now, and at which point my colleague and deputy chairman of the Global Discussion Forum, Stephen Tripp, is going to take over now and run things. So he's pretty good at this. I would just like to finish by thanking all 3 speakers. Absolutely superb. You've given us all an amazing amount of information today so far, and I'm sure you'll have more to say. And this topic is right at the forefront of people's thinking, not just in the UK, not just in Europe, not just in Australia, but in other countries as well. And I haven't looked at the list yet. It was way over 50 the last time I looked at how many people have joined us. But some of them might be from Asia as well, and they'll recognize some of these things. So with that, I'm going to now pass you back, and Stephen Tripp will run the rest of this. And beware, everybody, he's a pretty stern master of these things. Can I just say, I'm sure he'll say it, keep your questions short, please, so we can get as many in as possible. Stephen, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lee, and thank you to our speakers. That was a fantastic and interesting opening. Now's your chance to ask questions. Anyone on the Zoom call, the way to do it is to hit the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and put your hand up so I can see that you're ready to ask a question, and you can come off mute and address one of our speakers directly. Now, I'm going to kick things off by addressing Senator Roberts. Now, just to give some figures, just like Rob just alluded to, I was looking at the net migration for the UK in the year ending June 2024. Their net migration was 728,000. Here in Australia, in the year 2023 to 24, our net migration was 446,000. That was down from 536,000 the year prior. Now, this is an extraordinarily amount of people coming into our countries. I can't imagine the locals living in our countries are thrilled about this. In your opinion, why have the voting public never been given an adequate say into the net immigration intakes of our countries? Senator
Because the
Roberts.
media doesn't want to inform the public. They know what the public would think, and we've done that job pretty much, just Pauline and myself, Steve. Thank you for the question. I think the public have deliberately been kept in the dark. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong camera, I'm told. It's also part of a global phenomenon. We just heard Sir John Redwood discussing Germany's response as being quite common, similar to the United Kingdom. I'd also like to point out that this is being done, in my view, deliberately around the world. It's conscious because, as I alluded to, introduced the comment that this is done deliberately to chase the second agenda, which is a global governance, put in place global governance, which means smashing national borders, breaking down society. And I mean that sincerely. That's exactly what I think is going on. There were so many parallels with Sir John Redwood's comments. We've called for the government to deport 75,000 illegal people who are illegally here in Australia right now. That's the tip of the iceberg, we think. Same problems as Sir John Redwood, feeble compliance, to use his words. Same issue, driving down wages. We've got people under enormous pressure to work basically for the globalists. Minimal GDP per capita, minimal economic benefits. Same motive here. We've had to continue with Lee Evans's comments. We've had 8 quarters of negative gross domestic product per capita. We've had to build on Sir John Redwood's comments. We are bringing in supposedly skilled people to revitalise our nation and build houses. Well, of the people who are coming into the country, 0.6% are builders or construction workers. They're building houses for the other 99.4%. There are so many lies being told, Steve. We're being told that we need migrants to catch up with pre-COVID levels. Well, pre-COVID, we had 1.9 million people on temporary resident visas. We have now got 2.5 million. It's just another lie upon lie. It's a similar scenario to the COVID mismanagement, COVID fraud. COVID was real, but the response was just completely wrong, and based upon lies and inconsistencies. And the same lies were told from country after country after country around the world. We've had the same massive ramifications, cost of living going up, but it's been blamed on Ukraine. It's complete lie. The energy destruction of our country, the immigration overloading our services. The number one issue in our country is not immigration. The number one issue, it's a serious issue. The number one issue in our country is shoddy governance, dishonest governance. They don't make decisions, policies, legislation based on data. They make it based upon basically nonsense that it's cooked up, what the media tells us. We have a failure to invest in infrastructure for now decades. And the second biggest problem we have in our country is the ceding of sovereignty to international globalist organizations, the United Nations, World Economic Forum, various refugee groups. And so that's what I see is happening in this country, and it's happening around the world very much in a coordinated fashion, because there's a push to smash borders, break down society, and put in place an unelected socialist global governance. And that's not my words. That's the people at senior levels of the UN, their words. Late Maurice Strong, for example. Christiana Figueroa is pushing the climate fraud. These are their words. They want a new world economic order, a new way of running the place. And they want it socialist, unelected global governance. That's fact coming from their words.
Look, that's probably even more reason why we need to start having some more collaboration between our countries to share best practices on how to push back against this stuff, just like Senator Malcolm Roberts just raised there. But if anyone's watching this and you're thinking, how can I be involved in the next global discussion forum? It's by heading to one of the 4 websites, factsforeu.org, cibuk.org, commandingthenarrative.com, or australiansforbetter.com. If you sign up to our mailing list, you'll get the Zoom link, and you'll be able to join us in future global discussion forums and be part of this conversation right now. We've got some hands up ready to go with questions. The first one is Richard Shuttleworth. Richard, your question.
Good morning, everybody. I'm wondering, I'm living in London, so I'm talking about UK. Is there a case for ID cards? We've got so many credit cards and the government knows most of where I am. So what is the argument against them?
And who are you addressing that question to, Richard?
Well, anybody who cared to answer it, preferably, presumably, Sir John or somebody from UK, because it is a little bit biased towards this country.
Okay. Sir John? You're on mute, Sir John.
There is no silver bullet. People have looked at ID cards. The truth is that people can forge ID cards. They can misrepresent their identities with ID cards just as well as they do at the moment. We have a system where everybody who wants to work at the United Kingdom has to have a single unique identifier, a national insurance number. And what has happened is the state has issued more national insurance numbers than there are legal workers. And people manage to get hold of these national insurance numbers, even though it's meant to be the way disciplining the system. We also are dealing with people, in many cases, who are illegals. They've thrown their proper papers away. They could easily acquire alternative papers, including an ID card, from the people who forge passports and other travel documents to help them. So I do think we need a variety of measures to improve enforcement. I would just like to comment on your excellent first question, which is I think there are several main forces that have led to the surge in illegal and legal migration. In the UK, the pressure of the universities has been to have more and more foreign students whom they charge more than domestic students. So the foreign students have displaced some domestic students and have allowed the growth of the universities. That becomes a scandal if the so-called educational institution is not providing much or very good education, but is really a front to get people into Britain to take low-paid jobs. And part of the package often is implied that if somebody can come in and do a year or 2 years course with a not very reputable organisation, then they would be able to stay on and carry on working. Because as I remarked, quite often somebody comes legally and then becomes illegal by carrying on. There's been enormous pressure from big business every time they see a little bit of a shortage of labour in their area, or they think wages are going up too much. They shout out that they want to have more low-paid wage labour coming in from elsewhere, and too often ministers have given in. There's the tyranny of the international lawyers. Whenever ministers have tried, and in the United Kingdom, Conservative ministers in the immigration department try quite hard to take enforcement action or to impose limits on migration, there were always court cases, and quite often ministers lost in court. And then we would change the law, and then the international lawyers would again redefine what the law meant against the spirit of Parliament's law as we saw it. And so that has been a huge problem with appeal to European human rights law trying to trump domestic law where the intention should have been quite clear. And then, as I said in my opening remarks, there's been concerted pressure from the Treasury and other bad areas of advice in government about how you need all this cheap labour in order to have growth. So we need to win the arguments. And as the Senator has rightly said, we need to regain sovereignty to control these important policy areas. That is what the British people thought they did by voting us out of the EU. And one of the main reasons they voted for out of the EU was the open borders and mass migration going on within the EU. We have been able to control that, but then, unbelievably, the government machine and the lawyers decided on opening up the borders to everybody else. And so instead of overall migration going down because European migration went down, we had the reverse impact. That is why the public are so livid. And if you asked migration ministers of recent years, they would tell you, we did try, but it didn't work. Well, they should have tried harder, but it will require taking full legal control.
Thank you, Sir John. And to all our speakers, if you want to jump in and make a comment, Senator Roberts, Sir John Redwood, and also Rob Bates, feel free to do so. You don't have to wait for me. But moving on to the next question, all the way from Campbelltown, Australia.
Could I jump in there, please, Steve?
Yeah, go for it.
I just want to echo Sir John Redwood's comments. I think they're right on target. We have a similar system in this country. Administrative Appeals Tribunal is now the Administrative Review Tribunal. It is clogged up with so many immigration cases, and that's how we fund their defence, their cases, and then we end up keeping them here forever. So what we want to do is come up with an immigration review tribunal, so that if someone wants to appeal, he or she gets one shot at it, and that's it, gone. And we've got to do that. We've got to tighten up there. It is exactly the 3 or 4 groups of people that John Redwood just fingered. The universities, we've called it a Ponzi scheme, Sir John. They bring in cheap labour on the guise that they're students. We bring in low-paid workers. What we need to do is for the people to become aware of what is going on in our country and to retake control. It's a failure of democracy, because democracy is not a passive form of government. If it becomes passive, it lapses into tyranny. And so what we've got to do fundamentally, Steve, is get more people involved in politics and in becoming aware. What you and Adam are doing is wonderful.
Could I just jump in as well on the follow up to the point that the senator just made about many of the universities that are really pushing for foreign students to be admitted? I think he really is accurate to describe it as a Ponzi scheme, certainly in Australia, and it's definitely a term that's applicable in the UK as well. We have a target enmeshed in UK policy making now that effectively mandates that there has to be at least 600,000 international students in the UK at any one time. If you look at the actual data and you look at those courses that the government has identified as actually being useful to the British economy long term, around about 70% of foreign students coming in are doing courses that are frankly useless. They're to do with kind of leather construction, wardrobe design. I think we actually had a couple of individuals in the last couple of years coming in to study socialism and Marxism as well. And we've probably got enough of those already in the UK. Unfortunately, we don't need to be importing further numbers of them. And I think we need to realise that there's a huge stranglehold that the effectively university lobby has over policymakers. It's seen as a great British export. Well, if that's true, and it is something that we should be looking to send around the world, then a large number of the courses that individuals are actually coming in to the UK to study could frankly be done over Zoom or Skype. And I know it's not quite the same university experience. It doesn't mean that the university halls beer pong tournaments can take place, but I think it's really meets the needs of those that are looking to study in the UK without needing to impose sort of burdens on the housing supply and councils.
I really like this, that our speakers are interacting with each other. It's very exciting to see, and it's very thought-provoking. Now, I'm seeing a lot of people watching on YouTube. If you do have a question on YouTube, you can put it in the chat and I'll be able to read that out as well. But waiting patiently is a very notable politician all the way down in Campbelltown, New South Wales. Mr. Adam Zara, you have a question.
This one's to Senator Malcolm Roberts. Thank you, Stephen. Local government is heading down to Canberra mid-year to help shape federal policy on a local level. My question is, what can we do on a local level to mitigate the influx of migrants to our LGAs? Lack of federal funding and state funding to our infrastructure has blown out our hospital waiting times, surgery availabilities. It's created traffic congestion and housing shortages. How on a local level can we help you at a federal level mitigate these issues?
Data. Get the data and bring it down with you on all of those issues. That's the most important thing. Also, use every opportunity you can, Adam, to discuss the key imbalance or the structural reform that's needed in our country. For those in Britain and not in Australia, even for Australians, not many know about this. The Australian government is the major tax taker, so they have the money. The way our constitution is set up, the state governments have the power because they have the duties for most of the services from government. But the people with the problems to solve are the local councils. They're not a form of government, but they are local councils. So we've got the money, separate hands from the people with the power and the authority, separate hands from the people who are fixing it. And that's a complete mess. That destroys accountability. I can see you nodding now, Adam. That has to be taken care of and addressed fundamentally. So it's not just immigration. It's not just the impacts of mass immigration. It's also the fundamental structural reform that's needed in our country. So I would, but above all, get the data. The government, as I said, Liberal and Labor, the Uni Party, they're pushing international policies, global policies. They're not worried about data. Give them the data and find out a way to embarrass them with it.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Next question is from Tess. Tess, maybe start off by letting us know where you're from and feel free to ask your question.
Hello, I'm from Sydney and my question or comment is for Malcolm Roberts. What I'm looking at is the possibility, because many politicians have tried to do what you're doing and what you're all doing. And what we're seeing in the US is actually what I've been saying for a while. We need to make sure that the books of councils are completely open. Not-for-profit organisations like the one that I worked for, the Primary Healthcare Network, that installed the vaccines throughout Australia and gave all the GP education. Why are their books closed? You know, it's fully government funded. It needs to be open. And I'll put something in the chat. I've come under a lot of, I don't think I can, but I've come under a lot of attack from my professional bodies as a nurse because I've been speaking out. And these organisations, they all need to be accountable for their behaviour. Their books need to be open. The people need to be held to account. And it's fortunate, I think it was a Chevron case in the US that relates to Australia. I don't know, John, if it relates to the UK, but with this Chevron case, that's now been dropped. And what that apparently means is that these bureaucrats that hide in cupboards, as far as I can tell, or at home because they're working from home and not probably doing anything, they need to be held to account. Now, I worked for a really big health fund, I won't name which one, that had transitioned from a government organisation, and Senator Roberts will know who that is. And we found that our head of clinical governance for my division was not doing any work whatsoever. Goodness only knows what salary he was on, trained nurse and honourable discharge. He'd been working from home for at least 8 years. So we need full accountability. We need to know who's doing what where. And the same with councils. I've spoken to people, and I won't say which big Sydney council. Somebody had a full-time job at a Sydney council and at the RSL club. So we need full accountability because these, and I will call them cockroaches, they are stealing our money left, right and centre. They're hiding behind their first name and there's no real accountability. And like the attacks that have been happening on me, because I did win a big human rights case. I won the medical and religious breach of human rights over the COVID vaccine. The attacks are unconscionable.
Sorry, Tess. You're raising some great points, but we need to push on. So if you can just get to your question.
But can we all do that? What do you think, Malcolm? Do you think that'd be helpful?
Accountability is lacking in federal and state governments. We can see that abundantly, Tess. So thank you for your question. It's a common plague that wrecks our country. Both the title parties, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, are not interested in accountability, with a few exceptions of Liberal MPs and senators. But the Aboriginal industry, and it's white and black, it's not a racial thing, it's a white and black parasites are living off that. Activists, academics, politicians, bureaucrats, and they're just, and the people who should be getting the money in the communities are not getting it. And so this is a human catastrophe that's everyone knows about. The community is not getting it. It's a really sorry state of affairs. But meanwhile, the academics, the activists are getting money out of it. We've identified, Tess, $90 billion in the federal budget of waste and duplication. What we want to do with that is our policies will be putting it back so that people have more money in their pockets. Take it off the government and give it back to the bureaucrats. What we have to do is identify where the lapses are, where the breaches are, and address them. So I'll make it clear to you now that if the funding is coming from the federal government, and I assume it is, then give us questions to ask in Senate estimates to start exposing this. We're exposing the rorts across the governance in this country. So feel welcome to get hold of my office, and next Senate estimates questions we'll be putting on your behalf.
Thank you.
And I must apologise to Tess for cutting in, but I'll get the whip cracked on me if I don't keep people to short questions. By our chairman, Lee Evans, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, indeed. I agree with that. If people could actually refrain from making speeches and ask questions, we'll get through a lot more people that way. And I'm sure everyone understands that. I have a question for John Redwood. John, we've had a few questions about Australia, so forgive me, but this is more related to the UK. We've had problems with the ECHR, and this is the European Court of Human Rights, for those that don't know. And whilst we were a member of the EU, although this is not a part of the EU, it might as well be. It basically follows EU policy. There's been a lot of calls in the UK that we should leave the ECHR, and the reason, for those that don't know, is that the judges there, unelected judges, have been overturning decisions by UK courts about deporting foreign migrants, foreign nationals who've committed crimes in the UK. And I wonder if you could just talk about that for a moment and just explain to the audience what's going on. And what do you think now? Because there are increasingly questions from mainstream politicians about whether we should resile from certain aspects of the ECHR. Over to you, John.
As you say, we are under international law over these issues. What has happened is that a post-war settlement court was set up for a wider range of European countries than joined the EEC/EU. And the idea of that, which Britain sponsored, was that it would be some kind of a check on authoritarian or bad states at the policy level. But as with all these things, its powers and its scope have greatly widened because it hired a whole set of activist lawyers who then effectively granted a right of any individual living in any ECHR country to bring a case against their government in the ECHR if their own circumstances didn't suit them. And we've accepted this judicial drift. And so now a whole series of migration cases where we feel we've got a very good case, given government policy, go to the ECHR and we lose the case and we can't then deport or refuse entry or refuse grant of asylum. I and a few other members of parliament in the last parliament were very exercised about this. And so together with legal advice, we came up with an amendment to our migration law, which would have stopped the ECHR having any impact on British migration cases. And we didn't say we should just pull out of the whole thing. Some parts of it are perfectly benign, but we didn't want it making these individual migration cases. And so we used a device called a notwithstanding clause. And we said that you put into our immigration law how you're going to handle these immigration cases, and you put in a clause which says notwithstanding any other jurisdictions or measures, so that British courts know that they cannot look to the ECHR. They have to determine the law in accordance with the will of Parliament. Very simple device. It avoids a major row on pulling out of the whole thing. As you rightly say, because there are so many of these vexatious cases going against the United Kingdom government all the time, there's now a growing body of opinion in Britain which says, why don't we just pull out of the whole thing?
Okay, thank you, Sir John.
Can I make a point there, please, Steve?
Yes, go for it,
make the point. Sir John just spoke very well about the core issue there. The core issue is not the globalist organizations or the European organizations that are pushing this rubbish and destroying our country. The core issue is the parliaments that enable it to happen. Law after law after law is given power in this country by our parliament in Canberra we don't have to adopt the UN or the UN or the World Health Organization dictates, but we do. And so it's the parliaments of this country, just like the parliaments of Britain, that have the responsibility for the people of Britain, people of Australia. No one else.
No, that's right. It was only about 30 of us voted for a very sensible change to meet the wishes of the British people. The main parties in Parliament all ganged up to ensure that the international lawyers were going to carry on governing.
Senator, can I just say the camera in front of you is on to look at, by the way, directly in front of you. I know you've got more than one camera.
I keep forgetting it because you're all over there and I can't get away from people's eyes.
No. Look, that's it. You're looking at us right now. That's splendid.
I've only got about another 5 minutes on board. I'm sorry, but the studio has to close down.
Steve, can I direct you to Don Briggs, who's got his hand up, would like to say a word? Don.
Don, yep, I see your hand up. Go for it.
And then Rudy, please.
It's more an observation rather than a question, which troubles me. When people cannot achieve through the ballot box what they want, they take to the streets. Now, that seems to me to be a danger that is growing. The Southport riots after the murder of those 3 little girls, for example.
Sir John, do you want to comment on that, or maybe Rob Bates, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think you're absolutely right, Don. I think the polling after polling now shows, the British public are overwhelmingly in favour in some form of reduction, with around about 50% actually reaching the point where they'd happily have the whole migration system frozen, barring those roles that are essential. And despite this repeated message being delivered, I mean, I think what was Brexit if not a cry as well for control over our borders? The politicians in charge have really failed to take heed of that message. I think in particular the post-Brexit immigration system that was implemented, I think really shows the disconnect between those making decisions and the British public. What we've actually seen since 2021 is huge new visa routes opened up that have allowed hundreds of thousands of individuals from outside of the European Union to come into the UK. And unfortunately, it was a decision taken primarily because of the power of the bureaucracy gobbling up otherwise quite sound Conservative politicians and convincing them that certain measures were inevitable to avoid economic catastrophe. So I think that's the message that politicians are getting in their ear behind the scenes, is from these quangos, from these lobby interest groups, that without mass migration it would be absolute calamity. And unfortunately that too often drowns out the cries of the sort of disparate majority across the country.
Yeah. Rob, thanks for that. Can I just say, Stephen, with Senator having his studio shut down on him very shortly, can we just prioritise any questions about Australia before the Senator goes?
Yeah, so I know Katie McCallum is waiting patiently. I just want to give a shout out also to Joel Jamal, who hosts the ARC podcast here in Australia, in Sydney. That's where Malcolm Roberts is broadcasting from. So thank you, Joel, for helping facilitate Malcolm. I know that I've been in that studio. I know how distracting that TV is off to the side there. So I completely understand what Senator Roberts is going through. But a good friend of Senator Roberts is Katie McCallum. She's got her hand up. Katie, you've got a question?
Thanks, Stephen. Just in relation to what Don Briggs said before, he actually raised what I've been thinking about. And, there seems to be quite a bit of discontent in society here in Australia. And I'd be interested to know if it is across the board in the UK as well, in towns, in cities. My concern here is that with Donald Trump being the new president, there seems to be a whole new level of, I guess he's, and I love the guy myself, but there's a lot of angry people, and I'm concerned that they are going to take his actions in America and they will convert to action on the street in places like Australia. And I'm wondering if you feel the same, and if you are concerned in any way of that effect, or if you believe that it will have a positive effect within our governments, his executive orders and what he's doing in America. Thank you.
I take it that's for someone.
Well, I'm happy to say that I think there are already quite a lot of peaceful protests in the United Kingdom. We have a long tradition of peaceful protests, and the more annoying the government gets, the more likely there is to be considerably more of that. For example, at the moment, we have a lot of peaceful protesting going on about the attack on small family farms and the attack on small businesses with a very aggressive tax-raising budget. And we could well see protests on the streets about the pressure on public services in the way we've been talking about against this background. But I'm sure we're all Democrats here. We have no wish to see violent protests. That is never to be encouraged or praised. And where any danger of that is visible, then the government will quite rightly clamp down on it, as it did in the United Kingdom quite recently.
Thanks, John. Senator, did you have a comment on Katie's question?
Well, Katie's question. Thank you, Lee. Katie's question was about the United Kingdom, so no, I don't have any comments.
I know you have to go, Senator Roberts. So one final question to you. The federal election's coming up here in Australia, and you're going to have to campaign for re-election. So I guess use this opportunity to let us all know what the One Nation policy is on immigration with the election coming up. I read on your website that you want to cap migration to 130,000. Maybe expand on that so we all know where One Nation stands ahead of your re-election campaign.
Certainly, we want net zero or zero net immigration, but actually with that cap, it will turn out to be net negative immigration. So, but we've got an abundant source of labour in this country ready to go in the form of people who are pensioners right now who are penalised if they rejoin the workforce. So number one, we want to stop mass immigration. We want to work. Actually, that's about it, because the rest of them have to do with mortgage, with housing, which is the key problem that immigration is causing in this country. So it is deporting 75,000 illegal people and holding people accountable for the rest of them.
Can I just, thank you, Senator. Can I just butt in here, Stephen, just to say that our good friend Catherine McBride has a hand up, and those that don't know, would be an interesting one, I'm sure, to end on. By the way, Catherine, you need to unmute yourself if you want to ask the Senator or anyone a question. Catherine is a member of a government commission on trade. She'll explain that, no doubt. But she is an Australian who lives in London. So she kind of crosses the divide that, well, there's no divide, but she crosses the bridge, if you like, that we've formed today between particularly Australia and the UK. Even though this is global and there are people from other parts of the world, forgive us, we will cover you in future forums. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Lee. I hope you can hear me. I was interested in a lot of what Senator Roberts was saying about Australia. So my question is more about Australia than England, because he also used that fabulous term, the uni party. And I must say, with the exception of John Redwood and a handful of Conservative MPs, we also have a uniparty in the UK, where half of the things that the Labor Party are now doing that people are so outraged about were actually policies under the Conservative Party that they just didn't know about because it was being done. You had to read, as I do, government reports to even find out about them. And I was wondering if, I know Australia has an election this year, and if there is an anti-uni party development going on, because we're certainly seeing that in the UK, where more and more people in surveys are saying they're going to vote Reform, because the Reform Party is, besides being definitely anti-net zero, probably anti-immigration, or zero, and net zero immigration is one of their policies. But I was wondering if that would be the case in Australia, where you're going to see many more people voting for Senator Roberts' party or other parties. I don't know all of the people available in Australia, but what, are you having a rise of the uni-party vote, or are people still just going to vote as they always do, either Labor or Liberal, depending on what their family voted, sort of thing?
What we've seen over, thank you for the question. What we've seen over the last 30 years or so is a decline in the uni-party vote, Liberal and Labor, from about 95% down to around 66%. It's just plummeted, and it's continuing. Sadly, what we've seen is the original Greens pick up their vote, but fortunately, the Greens are now exposing themselves for who they really are. More and more people are waking up to the fact that it is a uni-party. Every major climate and energy policy, which has been so destructive towards our country, was introduced by the Liberals, yet most people think it was the Labor Party. Both are hollowing out the bush. One of them pretends to look after the bush. It's a global thing. It's not just when we had the censorship bills, and I won't go into the suite of 6 bills actually, that will head towards social credit systems. The Liberal Party introduced every one of them, and the Labor Party then actually put them into a vote. So they're both pushing the same global agenda. And if we look at the red and blue parties, you've got red and blue in Britain. We've got red and blue in Australia. We've got red and blue equivalents in New Zealand. Red and blue in Canada. Blue and red in the United States. They've reversed them there. Fortunately, Donald Trump is neither. And he's an orange, and One Nation is orange as well. So we're hoping that it mimics Trump down under. But you're absolutely right, and many people are waking up. We started using the term uni-party about 3 years ago, and it's coming back to us now. People talking about the uni-party. So the awareness is there. Whether or not the vote will, I never make comments about the future, but whether or not the vote will translate, that's up to the voters. But there's growing awareness that our problems are due to globalist policies being pushed through both puppet organisations, the Red Party and the Blue Party, Liberal and Labor. But I'm going to have to go, Steve.
Yep. No, thank you very much, Senator Roberts. Look, I can speak to say to the UK audience that you are probably the hardest working politician in Canberra. I think of you as the Ron Paul of Australian politics. I hope you take that as a compliment, because it is.
I certainly do. That's wonderful.
Yes, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I'll hand it over to
thank you,
our
Steve.
chairman.
And I want to acknowledge all the Britons involved, because it's very, very important that we address this as a global issue. Because it is a global issue. It's driven by the globalists.
Senator, can I just say, as chairman of the Global Discussion Forum, chairman of cibuk, and chairman of Facts for EU, we're enormously grateful for your time today. It's been very interesting to get your perspective on things. And just to throw one last thing in at the end, what a lot of people at the other side of the world may not know about Australia is that the industry that you worked in before you entered politics is highly significant to the Australian economy. Mining represents somewhere between 13 and 14% of GDP in Australia. And if you relate that back to immigration, one wonders really how many migrants are working in the mines and how many perhaps are not. And that's just something that you may want to comment on in a future session. But certainly Australia, you are sitting on an absolute gold mine, in some cases literally, in other cases precious metals, which came up with President Trump and Zelensky. You have rare earth, I think they call it, materials there. Australia is in a magnificent place, and we wish you well in your struggles in Parliament, and we wish you well in the forthcoming election. But thank you.
Thank you very much. It's perhaps an important thing to say that Australia is the largest exporter of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. The largest exporter, but we can't use the stuff here, even though it's a miracle that causes human progress, enables human progress. So that's how insane our world is, all due to globalist policies that the Chinese are not implementing, Russians are not implementing, Indians are not implementing. So that's a salutary lesson for our country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. We'll let you go and we will carry on. So we'll carry on with Rob Bates. I have a question for you, Rob. I'm seeing a lot of images on social media of the negative impact of immigration on your country. What warnings can you give from the UK to Australia and the rest of the world when it comes to mass immigration?
So I think we've discussed the economic costs that come with mass migration. I think that's been discussed both on the UK basis and Australia. But I think there's also a huge social cost that comes with mass migration on the scale that we have seen here in the UK. When it comes to crime, for instance, we put out a report about a month ago that showed that foreign nationals across the board are actually twice as likely per 10,000 of the population as the British population to fall foul of the law and to end up in a set of handcuffs. And then when you actually look at that broken down by offence type, when it comes to sexual offences, they're 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for sexual offences than the British population. The way the conversation is going in Britain at the moment is the economic arguments for mass migration have collapsed. It's almost baked into discussions now that it hasn't quite worked out how it was promised in the 1990s, and therefore those that are still somehow arguing for it, much like the Japanese soldier in the trenches 20 years after the end of World War II, they're having to resort to ever more arcane and obscure arguments. So one of the key ones that they rely on at the moment is that it allows us to plug gaps in the economy, and the main one of those being the health and social care sector. Unfortunately, that basically denies progress. That such a policy doesn't recognise the sheer pace of automation and the transference that could be taking place towards robotics to fulfil many of the functions in care homes for elderly individuals in particular. The Office for National Statistics here in the UK put out a report a few years ago that suggested that by 2030, around about 50% of the roles in our health and social care system would be susceptible to some form towards automation. But yet we have at the moment one of the largest drivers of net migration in the UK being the health and social care route, precisely because politicians have almost ignored the fact that progress does take place. And of course, when it comes to individuals coming in on a work visa to work in health and social care, what isn't taken into account is that these individuals after 5 years are given indefinite leave to remain, which effectively releases them from their obligation to the care sector, and they can go and work into any sector they wish. So the idea that this is somehow addressing the problems that are systemic to the health and social care sector is to ignore the basic fact that these individuals after 5 years will be pursuing other careers almost definitely. I think we'll see that come next year when the first tranche of health and social care visas start getting indefinite leave to remain.
Thank you, Rob. Sir John, do you want to follow up on that at all? What warnings can you give Australia and the rest of the world with what you're seeing in the UK?
Well, I don't think you want low-paid people in the care sector. You want, as we've been hearing, an intelligently run care sector that uses training and suitable support machinery and computing so that we can have better paid carers who can engage fully with the people they're looking after. The other problem with those who think mass migration is the answer to temporary shortages in recruiting is that, of course, if you invite low-paid people in and they bring dependents with them, you're creating much more extra demand for the care sector at the same time as you're trying to resolve the labour shortage. So I don't think there's a cheap and easy answer. I think the care sector is on a journey in my country, and it needs to be faster on that journey in the case of some of the care homes. Towards a better paid profession with better protocols and better methods of working, so that we can recruit, train and retain our own care workers rather than relying on this fluctuating group of people who, as we've heard, might come in and do some care working for a bit and then wander off and do something else and gain entry when they were only meant to be doing social care.
Thank you, Sir John. Just want to remind everyone to please head to our websites, factsforeu.org, cibuk.org, commandingthenarrative.com, or australiansforbetter.com. You can also donate. It does help us out a lot if you can donate to us. So those options are there. Please support us, please follow us, and head to those websites. Now, I've got some more hands up. Rudy, your turn to ask a question. Let's start off by hearing from where you are from.
Yes, calling from Buckinghamshire in the UK. And I had a question. It actually goes back to a discussion a little while ago about the ECHR. I was sort of curious the other day as to where all these rights and everything came from. And I went back to the United Nations Charter in 1948. I suggest you all sort of track it down and read it. It has some a lot of very fundamental principles about equal treatment of all people who subject to them being nationals of the same country. Whilst it doesn't, it's quite protective of people's rights once they are nationals and they have to be treated equally. It doesn't confer people the ability to choose the nation that they would like to be a citizen of. I mean, basically, they're born citizens of their country, and their country can't revoke it. And it seems to me that the ECHR seems to go a long way beyond that in terms of conferring rights on all sorts of people that actually interfere quite seriously with the rights of indigenous peoples, to their own property and their, the public services and things that they've invested in. So the question is really why is it that the ECHR has taken dominance over the United Nations Charter in such a way as to actually introduce many principles in its workings that are actually in contradiction of the more fundamental rights to a nation and a nationality and equal treatment?
Well, I think the answer to that is, as I was describing, the European Court of Human Rights has aggressively expanded its jurisdiction, and with a group of lawyers who are determined to intervene in a whole series of individual case decisions in member states' countries. They've exerted this power. And on the immigration subject, they all seem to be like-minded, that they're always trying to find ways to make it easier for people to get into somebody else's country by asserting the right to family life and so forth, which was not envisaged either in the original ECHR or in the original UN documents, which were about the same time post the war. But the UN isn't going to assert a counter power to determine those cases in the opposite direction. There's no conflict of laws here. The UN has stood aside, and the ECHR has grabbed this territory, and then the European Union reinforced that because they had a lot of sympathy with it. So they replicated a lot of it in European Union law as well.
But presumably there's nothing to say that, one respects the United Nations Charter of Human Rights. One just doesn't, one chooses not to participate in the extensions that have been introduced to it by the ECHR.
That is something that we can decide as a country in the way I've been describing. But when I and a few other MPs tried to roll back on ECHR in these sensitive matters, that was not the will of Parliament, and it's clearly not the will of the new government. The new government is even more dramatically in favour of international lawyers than the outgoing government was.
But the things that get introduced...
Sorry, Rudy, I'm sorry.
I'll shut up.
Sorry, you can come back later, but there's other people that want to ask questions. So if you don't mind, let's let you come back on that. Just before we go to my colleague Ben, who I think wants to ask a question about that hasn't been really covered very much so far, which is the integration of migrants into societies, which I think everyone would agree is quite an important issue. Just before that, let me just pick up on what Stephen said. Events like this do not happen by accident. It takes an enormous amount of work and coordination to put them together. And the organizations involved in this desperately need funding. I'm going to give you one figure from the UK, that the opposite side of the fence in the UK has received well over £3 million, and correct me, but I think that's well over 6 million Australian dollars, to the organisations that fund them from a foreign billionaire. On the other side of the fence, you've got people like us. You've got Facts for You, who work 7 days a week. You've got CIB UK. You've got Stephen Tripp's organisation in Australia, Australians for Better Government. And these organisations are getting an absolute pittance. And certainly I can speak as chairman of some of the organisations I represent in telling you that the people that are working in the teams that I represent are working way under the minimum wage. And if at all possible, can I just ask you to be generous today if you appreciate this and donate? And it's very easy. You go to factsforyou.org, factsforyou.org/news. Have a look at the news there, and then there's a donate button in the menu. Same is true of CIB UK. Same is true of ABG, the Australians for Better Government. So please, if you want this kind of thing to happen again, please back us. Sorry.
So, Lee, I was just going to endorse that as Deputy Chairman of CIB UK. You'll appreciate how proactive Lee in particular has been in trying to put our case to the general public, and we are incredibly grateful to Sir John and others who've campaigned on our behalf. But the odds are massively against us. As I say, there is a huge Remainer establishment that wants to take us back into the European Union and to continue along the failed consensus that Malcolm and others have been challenging. So we really, really do appreciate and need your help. And I would suggest that CIB UK are in the vanguard of that. There are no other pressure groups and campaign groups that are doing remotely as much as we are, and Lee in particular, who deserves a special round of applause for that. Could I just ask further to the other point that Lee raised, to Rob, perhaps I could raise this question about integration that Lee mentioned. It is a huge consequence, obviously, a policy consequence of mass and uncontrolled immigration. To what extent, Rob, does your pressure group work with others to try and develop a coherent policy of integration? Because so far as the rest of us can see, no such policy seems to exist at all.
Well, I think we first of all need to actually distinguish between what we want from those waves of migrants coming into the UK, whether we want integration, which really is a one-way street, which requires British society to adopt the mores and traditions and habits of those individuals coming into the UK from another country, or whether we think that assimilation actually needs to be the objective of policy making, and those individuals coming in are expected to adopt the British way of life and culture and a veneration for our history, rather than us having to effectively compromise after compromise after compromise. I think that actually the integration argument is for far too long what politicians have kind of led on as their objective, and they've spoken in very soft, warm words about needing to tolerate other people's traditions. And unfortunately, it's got us to the situation where we're in now, where there are many parts of the UK that are siloed, and to the average punter observing these areas, they wouldn't feel like Britain. I think there's a key statistic that really shows the scale of the problem, whether it is integration or assimilation that we're aiming for, which is that around about 1 million people that are foreign born currently living in Britain don't speak English at all, or don't speak English very well. And that really is a failure of the state. It's a failure of our migration system, which puts no real onus on these individuals coming into the UK to learn the language. And that, again, is reflective of the fact that anyone and everyone is welcome in Britain, and we really do roll out the red carpet for individuals coming from different backgrounds, rather than expecting them to come to the UK, pull the socks up and become British. So I think and with regards to your actual question, what discussions are happening, I think there's a real interesting conversation going on in the UK at the moment between really those of a kind of Gen Z bent, just discussing what it actually means to be British, and where it needs to be going forward. And I think it's an important one because by 2035, 1 in 4 people living in this country will have been foreign born, which is a staggering number. And if you don't have proper processes in place to ensure that these individuals actually are meshed into the country of origin's culture and way of life, then you're just storing up huge problems for yourself.
That's by when? 2035, did you say?
By 2035, yes.
Ooh. Right. Thank you. That is a...
Lee, can I just say that I need to move on. So unless there are any other questions for me, I will thank you all very much and reinforce the message that Facts4EU and the other organisations are well deserving of support. We have mighty battles still to fight and win.
Yes, can I just say, John, well, you know how grateful I am for you attending today. A vitally important event, I think, which will be now published in terms of clips for social media, because we have to do clips. Nobody looks at long sessions like this, but we'll also publish the full Monty as well. To pay for the production costs of all of that, of course, at the moment that's coming out of my pocket, and I've been funding this for 10 years, and I don't have any money left. So, but John, you've been a stalwart, you've been a supporter. Much more importantly for me, you've stood up in Parliament and said the right things for so long, and I applaud you for that. I think everybody from the UK would probably echo that. So thank you very much for attending today, and thank you for your service, which has been quite remarkable.
Well, thanks again. And for those who are interested, I do a daily story analysis on johnredwood.com, 7 days a week. Been doing that for 15 years. And I also now quite often do slots on GB News and Talk TV, because these arguments matter a great deal to me, and I still want to help you win them.
You're most kind. So now back to Stephen to run affairs. I think Ben is got something, and then I know Adam Zara's had his hand up. I'm sorry I interfered, Stephen, but Ben, do you want to say something before passing back to Stephen and probably?
Well, just to thank Sir John, indeed, very much indeed for his attendance, and to Senator Malcolm as well. It is hugely appreciated, and obviously we're doing our best through you to get our message out to as many as we can. This is a vital issue, and CIB UK are at the forefront of this, so any support you can give us will be hugely appreciated. Stephen, can I pass then back to you?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Lee. And also thank you, Sir John. Now, if you want to follow our speakers, you can do that. Sir John Redwood and also Senator Malcolm Roberts are on all social media. They have their own websites. As Sir John said, he's got his daily blog. Malcolm Roberts also has the Malcolm Roberts website, and of course Facebook, X, all those platforms. You can follow them there. If you want to follow Rob Bates, you can head to centreformigrationcontrol.com and follow everything there. Now, Mr. Adam Zara has got his hand up. It's good to hear from him again. What's your question, mate? You're on mute, Adam.
I unmuted myself before, and then I muted myself again because I was like, just background noise. But okay, this question would be for Rob. I guess the way, mainstream media and I guess left-wing politics goes, it's wrong to expect immigrants who are coming to a destination country to assimilate to their destination country. So I don't think it's wrong. I think it's reasonable to expect immigrants that come from another country that come to, say, Australia, for example, should be able to speak the language, number one, especially if they're, and I've noticed recently that a lot of immigrants come to healthcare, hospitals, and things like that, nurses and things like that, and they can barely speak English. So, sick patients or sick Australian patients or English-speaking patients can barely understand their nurses or doctors who are speaking to them. So is it wrong to expect immigrants to assimilate and conform to their destination country's ideals and policies?
No, it's the only way to make the current situation work. I think, unfortunately, those in control of the media, those on the media, those politicians that are in favour of mass migration, don't quite understand the dynamic that is taking place. An individual coming to the country, in their eyes, is doing so out of sheer benevolence for the country that they're heading to. They're coming to the UK or Australia, for instance, out of a sheer love and wanting to volunteer their services. I think that completely misunderstands the situation. These individuals are coming first and foremost for their own betterment. But what that paradigm does really perpetuate is this idea that, you know, they've left behind kind of their rich cultures and their ways of doing things, that we therefore need to lay out on a platter for these individuals and to allow to take place. There's been a huge discussion in the UK at the moment. There's a tube station in East London known as Whitechapel, which has in the last few years recently emblazoned itself with a name in Bengali, and there's been a huge conversation about whether that's really the right approach. I would argue that it really isn't. I think it really allows the perpetuation of countries of origin's culture to insist on you can. We have to ask ourselves, where do we actually want to be in 10 years' time? Do we really want to be a society that's fragmented along, you know, myriad number of lines of cultural and national loyalties, or do we actually want everyone living in our country to have a loyalty first and foremost to the country in which they live? Unfortunately, politicians at the moment are too soft-footed when it comes to really tackling this issue. I think unfortunately the narrative has been sort of accompanied with a huge swathe of funding as well. The last 3 years, about £1 billion has been spent in the UK on providing translation services for individuals that aren't able to speak English. Another report has come out by an MP in the UK called Rupert Lowe, who found that, you know, DWP benefits centres in the UK are translating texts and bringing in translators of 120 odd languages. So these are individuals that are coming to the UK looking to claim social security and benefits, but are being able to do so because we're translating and interpreting the texts for them. So it's a ridiculous situation that actually stores up a lot of problems as we become increasingly we see increase in the migrant population in the UK as well. As I said, a quarter by 2035.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I appreciate that. I feel very similar in the same way. And just in the hospitals alone over the last few weeks, we've just had a few people in there and stuff like that, and myself as well. And I mean, it's not like that. It's like there's no care or respect. And the thing is as well, just sorry quickly, I know we're busy, but when nurses or when they bring in healthcare workers into, I know, Australia, our standards are much higher than a lot of the places where we're getting our migrants from. So we might bring over somebody who's a nurse, but they actually cannot be a nurse, male or female. They can't be a nurse straight away. So they can only come into the system as maybe an EEN, which needs to be supervised by a qualified nurse. So then we have to pay for their training. And normally in general nursing is younger females, individuals. Okay, so then if they have a husband or if they have children overseas, we have to bring all of them over, which was alluding to a few points that other people were making and other speakers were making. So what happens is you're bringing in one person who's skilled, but are you bringing in more, and also probably from, like, I'm not going to say third world countries, but maybe not as healthy countries as well. So then, like other speakers were saying, you're bringing in somebody who could potentially be a nurse in a year or two after their qualifications are certified in Australia. Then what happens is you're bringing in the potential of 1, 2 or 3 extra people who will be, are they as qualified? Then you have children who will also be burdens on the system and maybe become useful citizens in the future. But is there, well, I'm not seeing any emphasis on assimilation, because I think that's the difference between
Adam, the whip.
Yeah.
The whip is coming, mate.
The whip. Okay, go on. No, go for it. Yeah. Anyway, that was my point. So sorry about that. I'm used to speaking myself.
No, you make a great point, Adam, about the those coming into work in the health sector, whether they are at perhaps the standard that otherwise British trained or Australian trained individuals in the health sector would meet. I think in the UK, the non-EEA, non-European nationals are referred to the General Medical Council with complaints at about twice the rate they are British. And then if we flip it around as well, there is also, of course, the fact that should we really be asset stripping those countries around the world that are on the World Health Organization's red list as having, quite parlous healthcare systems themselves? It doesn't quite seem like it's fair on either of us, really, to have a lowering of our standards, but at the same time depriving the most vulnerable countries of individuals that could perhaps help them at least start to build a healthcare sector. So I think you're absolutely right to raise that point.
I think that's an excellent point, Rob, if I may say so, and I can vouch for that on a personal level. But we've got Catherine McBride with her hand up. If you don't mind, Stephen, I'm just going to call on Catherine. You have to unmute yourself first, Catherine. But I've no doubt you've got something interesting to say. Go ahead.
Well, I was just very interested in that last comment because it is something that I've looked into here when during the Brexit debates, many people were saying that the UK NHS would collapse without EU immigrants. And it turned out even then that the vast majority of our immigrants in the health service working, doctors and nurses, were coming from developing countries. India was supplying our largest number of doctors. The Philippines was providing our largest number of nurses. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any extra qualifications they have to go through to get in and work for us. But what I find interesting is we were restricting the number of doctors we could train ourselves. And
Correct.
So you're right. The point that was just made, we are desperately asset stripping very poor countries of their doctors and nurses. There are more Zambian doctors working in the UK, and I know this through a Zambian charity, than there are doctors in Zambia. And, Zambia is not a rich country. And when you look at that, you think, why are we restricting our own students from training and importing all of these people from third world countries? And I was wondering if the same thing happens in Australia, if there is this very tight limit on the number of people they can train.
Yeah, and can I just throw in one thing before Stephen takes us back to Australia, and that it's not just doctors. The number of nurses being trained in the UK has been severely limited, and there's a lot of complaints from young people wanting to train as nurses. There are no places on the course. Why? Because these positions are being filled by others who've migrated into the country.
And we've made it a university course for our own nurses.
Well, I know that's another point, yeah. And you're quite right, Catherine.
So it's quite expensive to train as a nurse in the UK, where I think the people training as a nurse in the Philippines are doing it without a university course.
Yeah, there's no comparison in standards. But I think Adam made an excellent point that you picked up on, Catherine. By the way, you need to mute yourself because otherwise we're going to have you walking through some corridor somewhere. But Adam made a superb point, I think, about this. But Stephen, back to you.
So this is the 7th global discussion forum that we've had now, and the new kid on the block is Australians for Better Government. It's the 4th participating entity. And just to let you know about Australians for Better Government, if you don't know already, it's a grassroots people's movement to really reform our government. We can't rely on politicians anymore to make changes to our government. And I think what's been highlighted on this global discussion forum and also previous global discussion forums is that the majority of our problems these days are purely the result of government and bad politicians. So what we want to achieve at Australians for Better Government is to have a grassroots movement to push back against that. Please head to australiansforbetter.com and you'll see all the proposals that we're presenting, and you can also sign up for membership as well and keep up to date with everything that we're doing and join the movement. Be part of us, because the more people that we can attract, the stronger that we can be. And as as Lee said before, and also Ben, the other side of politics get a huge amount of resources, but we have to rely on grassroots movements. Now, on to Rob again. I want to ask a question. How does mass immigration impact cost of living, housing affordability, and also wage growth? We haven't talked too much about that tonight, so do you want to make some comments about that?
Yeah, I think with regards to wage growth and indeed just employment in general of British individuals, what we have seen since 2021, and sorry to keep banging on about it, but the health and social care visa that was introduced was the average profile of a migrant coming into the UK, that their salary has fallen by about £10,000 between 2021 and 2023. Of course, these individuals are making an ever-growing proportion of the care sector, and almost setting the expectations of employers in this area as to what an appropriate wage is, and that really is a huge shame, because there are, as much as left-wing politicians and media pundits might not like to admit it, it's still a huge desire amongst young Brits to go into the care sector. It's just they are not being afforded the opportunities. And then when you look at where the benchmark has been set, I think it's just over £20,000 an individual needs to be earning to come and work in the care sector. That's not something that a young Brit should actually be expected to be earning from the get-go. I think we need to recognise as well that there is a lot more that employers can be doing to encourage the millions of Brits that are currently economically inactive and therefore not even engaging in the workforce. And that does, in some instances, pertain to trying to pay higher wages, although of course, as I said, the incentives just simply aren't there at the moment, because they've got so used to being able to pay absolute rock bottom prices. But they also need to start having greater expectations on them to provide training and some form of job perks as well, whether that be car pools or whether that be even just a break room effectively. I think that the whole situation, I am using the care sector as an example because it's where the wage prices and the general malaise that has taken place by the employees is most acute. The whole situation has really priced Brits out of the market, because these are individuals that have got a certain standard of living expectation because they live in Britain, a Western country, and that's quite their right to have as well. But then when they are having to compete with individuals that have got a fast track route into these professions with no real expectation of having to undergo training or provide evidence of a certain degree of qualification, it becomes incredibly difficult for these people to compete. So I think with that sector, the price expectation now is incredibly hard to see how we get that back up without having to have a real conversation that is going to have lobby groups in the care sector kicking up a huge fuss. I think across the board, when it comes to housing, we of course have the new Labour government with these grand plans to build, I believe, 300,000 houses a year. That's something that's never been accomplished in recent history in Britain. We've, on a good year, managed just over 200,000. But if you look at the levels of net migration that we are seeing of net 500,000, of course, not each one of those individuals requires a house of their own, but many of them will be needing to get some house. You realise that the maths just simply does not add up, and therefore we are going to see a real compounding of houses being split into HMOs, which is a huge problem at the moment. There's a real proliferation of terraced houses in London in particular being split up into 5 or 6 apartments, and that comes with it an accompanying reduction in the quality of life that is perhaps harder to measure in official statistics. But I think across the board, when it comes to these kind of metrics, the maths just does not add up with migration and what the government is trying to do to mitigate some of its downsides. And I think housing is a key part of and a key example of that.
Thank you, Rob. We're getting towards the end now, so if you do have a question, please don't hold back. Put your hand up so I can see you there in the Zoom. Again, if you want to be part of one of these in the future, please head to one of those websites that we've been mentioning all the way through, factsforeu.org, which you should be visiting every day for Lee's great articles anyway, cibuk.org, commandingthenarrative.com, or australiansforbetter.com. Now, another question for you, Rob. This probably takes in the whole umbrella of what we've been talking about tonight, but why are our governments so addicted to immigration if there's all these negative impacts that come from it?
So you can probably attribute some of it to ideology. I think in Britain in particular, our leaders tend to be drawn from quite a cosmopolitan class, even those that lead the nominal Conservative Party. Boris Johnson, of course, is probably your archetypal kind of cosmopolitan individual, really. But I think there's a bigger problem, and I think that the bigger problem is that we've allowed a real proliferation of the state apparatus over the last 20 or 30 years here in Britain. We've seen a surge in the number of quangos, which are these kind of non-governmental advisory bodies that give advice on things such as the economy, housing policy, and migration. Unfortunately, these effectively act as in-house lobby outfits that are, they kind of receptacles for all interested industries that would like to see migration remain at incredibly high levels. They do regular consultations and calls for evidence, which are almost always exclusively contributed to by associations that would like to see, and big businesses that would like to see, current levels continue. And then, unfortunately, this is fed into ministers as fact. And therefore, if you're a politician trying to make a decision and you're faced with, even if you had instincts to reduce immigration, you're faced with a choice between your ideological persuasion and what you've been presented with by officials, it's very hard to then resist that so-called official advice. Of course, Sir John mentioned earlier the Treasury and the grip that has on its Treasury modelling, which has a lot of problems with it being far too static and not really factoring in a whole host of secondary problems. But we also have an organisation called the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, which since 2010 has really called the shots when it comes to economic policy in the UK, and chancellors really have to bend the knee to its whims. Unfortunately, that grossly overstates the economic impacts of migrants. It attributes to every migrant the same economic value, no matter what their salary, no matter their employment status, no matter their nationality of origin. And unfortunately, that really skews the pitch. We did a report a few months ago that showed that the OBR had actually unwittingly attributed to foreign students the same work profile and earnings as an individual on a full-time salary, which is physically impossible given these individuals are capped at being able to work 20 hours a week. And that really actually overstated the benefits of migration to the economy, the fiscal contribution, by about 8 billion. So there's a lot of noise, and unfortunately it's very difficult for ministers to disentangle themselves and to actually stick with their convictions if they do have any. And if they don't have any, and they are in favour of continuing mass migration, then it just feeds into their existing biases as well. So that's the problem as I see it in the UK.
Yeah, and I suspect, Rob, thank you for that. I suspect that this is echoed around the world as well. Just before Stephen passes over to somebody else for a question, I'm not sure. I think Ben has another one. Anyone else?
Could I just add? Could I just add one thing? Sorry, I just wanted to say something that has just been said, and it's incredibly important. That people do watch things that come up on government consultations, because I agree with the last speaker that only vested interests and lobby groups ever reply to them, and most people don't. We've had city ones where the big city firms don't even bother replying, so we get ridiculous regulations that everyone then complains about without realising the process of how this happens. So your last speaker just made a really key point, Lee, that I think we all need to get on the case and keep watching this stuff. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No. I was just going to say, before I hand back to Stephen for just a few more questions, we've only got, by the way, about 10 minutes left before we start wrapping up. So I've seen, by the way, in the gallery, there's some very interesting people. There's a couple of Michaels that I'm aware of. I'm surprised they haven't piped up yet. Can I just say there's another way of supporting organisations that Stephen rattled off to you. It doesn't just have to be about money, although we desperately need it. It's also about retweeting and reposting the information that all these organisations put out there. So whether it's factsforyou.org, whether it's cibuk.org, whether it's AustraliansForBetterGovernment.com, or commandingthenarrative.com, any organisations that are putting out there things that you think, I wish this was on the mainstream media more often, you could do your bit without spending any money at all, simply by reposting this stuff so that it gets to a wider audience. And also tell your friends, to come to the next global discussion forum if you like this one. If they email us, anyone, by the way, I'm perfectly happy to have emails. They can email me at lee.evans@cibuk.org if they're interested in supporting or indeed helping in practical ways. I'd be delighted to hear from anyone. And I can always direct people to the right organisation, perhaps, that they might want to support financially, if that's what they want to do. But anyway, that's enough of the sort of plug for us. But it's not so much a plug. It really is just saying that organisations on our side of the fence really do need your support. And the more you can give us, whether it's financial, whether it's promoting, the better. So, Stephen, I can see you're grinning all over your face.
I'm just getting a very private message from someone saying that I should crack the whip on you, Lee. But
yeah, you should.
I can see Ben with his hand up.
Yeah, Rob, just on an ancillary point, which is we've heard a lot about two-tier policing, for example, and I wondered to what extent policing was affected by levels of immigration and whether that it extended over to that. And the other one was actually the impact of migrant children in schools and whether that actually is holding back class development because there are many foreign language students in school who are struggling to keep up. I just wondered whether you had anything on either of those two areas.
So yes, on policing and the impacts that current migration levels have, as I said earlier, there's been a huge uptick since 2021 through to 2024 in the number of arrests of foreign nationals, disproportionately arrested compared to the UK population. But the bigger problem is there's a huge discrepancy at the moment between the number of crimes that are reported to police and the number of crimes that are forecast to actually take place. And unfortunately, these, as we're seeing levels of mass migration at such a huge level and the effective silification of society that takes place as a result of that, it's increasingly difficult for the police to govern and to manage those areas, and they're becoming increasingly reliant on, as a result, community leaders, self-appointed community leaders, which is an incredibly vague term that was effectively concocted under New Labour to try and justify elevating some individual to the role of spokesperson. But it's the police are having real difficulty in actually penetrating those areas and dealing with those areas in the same way that they would predominantly British area. I think we all grew up with there was a kind of social contract that existed between the British public and the bobby on the street, that these areas that have come from vastly different cultures and different relationships and expectations with law enforcement makes it a far more difficult task for police officers. On schooling and migration, you hear of countless examples now where English is spoken as a first language by a minority of students. Unfortunately, what this really does lead to in the long run is a general dropping of educational standards, because you have a lowest common denominator feature there, where you have to try and breach 5 or 6 different linguistic groups in just one classroom, and you have to try and engage with each individual in a manner that they're able to comprehend. We already know that classrooms are vastly oversubscribed, again as a result of mass migration in large part. But the difficulty then comes with, how is a teacher that say their first tongue is English, how is a teacher supposed to bridge the gaps between a classroom that has Lithuanians and East Timorians and Bangladeshis? It just really isn't possible without having to effectively take the curriculum, take what needs to be conveyed to these pupils, and boiling it down into the lowest common denominator that can be understood by all. And to be honest, I think educational attainment across the board has been falling in this country for decades now, arguably. And I think, unfortunately, as I said, again, sorry to keep beating on about it, a quarter of the population will now be foreign-born by 2035, and that's split across a whole number of different nationalities. You've got Indians, Poles, Bangladeshis, all making up the kind of within the top 10. So it's an increasingly difficult situation that without that stimulation that I talked about earlier, is going to only put teachers in an ever increasingly difficult situation, and one that really we'll find in the end can't be navigated.
Thank you, Rob. This will be the last question from me before we wrap up. When Senator Roberts was on before, he spoke about the goal of the World Economic Forum is to smash global borders. How do you feel about that comment?
I think across the board there is a whole apparatus of international organisations that really see national borders as an inconvenience towards grand schemes. And of course, it's not just on immigration. Senator Roberts obviously made reference to net zero as well. But in the UK in particular, we've got ourselves tied in knots by an international apparatus of the ECHR and the Refugee Convention that was created in the post-world order, which was a world that was completely different to the one that we are now living in. It was a time before mass globalization really kicked off. Travel times were 2-3 times as long as they now are. We didn't have Telegram, we didn't have TikTok, we didn't have these with which communication can take place. And the fact is that these the Refugee Convention in particular was created at a time when it was assumed that those that are having to flee persecution, war, would be resettled in areas that are geographically similar to their own, geographically just around the corner. And we saw that obviously with Jews fleeing the persecution of Hitler. Unfortunately, now that's not the case. Unfortunately, we have individuals flying across 10, 15 countries because it's just as easy as crossing across 1 or 2 national borders. But yet the Refugee Convention and the ECHR are still stuck in their same paradigm of those that would be fleeing persecution being of culturally similar and geographically proximate nations. That doesn't exist anymore. And I think, European Union, WEF, UN, that there is a general sense that solutions are only really able to be provided at the very tippy top of governance structures. They have an inherent distrust to localized communities to take situations and to provide their own solutions. And I think there's been a row back in the last 10 years, but I don't think anywhere near enough to try and reassert the predominance of nation states. And it's hard to see really, given where things are, that nation states can ever be put back into the ascendancy of an international order that has got so used now to these globalist organisations, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you for the audience for participating tonight. This has been a great global discussion forum. I might hand it over to Ben Phillips to make some final comments. Ben's always working very hard, taking notes and everything. So, Ben.
Rob, Stephen, thank you, and a particular thank you to you, Rob, for coming along to be our third and very valuable and fascinating contributor. So. And giving up your Sunday to do so. It's been a fascinating exchange. I dare say we'll be in touch on a regular basis going forward, because this is certainly one of our key agenda points. It's a huge concern to the traditional Brexit movement. It was indeed a key factor behind the vote to leave, and it is a huge international issue now. It's transferring across all countries, particularly in the West, and whether you'll leave or remain, this is now an existential crisis. So hugely grateful to you, Rob, for your contribution. Thank you. And Lee, over to you.
Just finally, everyone, thanks for coming on a Sunday morning. It's a big ask. Sunday morning in Europe and a Sunday evening in Australia. And various other times around the world. So, as Ben said, thanks for giving up your time on a Sunday. I think it's been an important session. It'll be very interesting to see the playback on all of this and the key messages from some of our speakers. Very grateful to them, obviously, for giving up their time, busy people. So I think that's pretty much it. We had some great questions from the audience as well. There was real interaction. If you'd like these things to carry on, we do them every couple of months. If you'd like that, then promote the hell out of us and the various organisations that have co-produced this. Also, you might want to go along and look at Rob Bates' site, the Centre for Migration Control. John Redwood's, which is johnredwood.com, I think. It's put in John Redwood's diary into Google, you'll get it. Short pieces every single day. Amazing what he does. And I don't know the senators, but Stephen will tell you that. And so have a look at that. And I'm sure Adam Zara, our good friend there, must have something himself. So Stephen, back to you. I think I've said everything I want to say. Thank you all. And I think that's it. It's a wrap. You're on mute, Stephen. Stephen, you're on mute.
I'll just take the opportunity quickly to say thank you very much, Lee, Ben, Stephen, for organising a great event. Very interesting conversations.
Oh,
that's very kind, Rob, and thank you for coming along.
Stephen's back. Yeah.
Sorry, I lost my screen there for a moment. Some gremlins are getting in the system. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. This has been a great global discussion forum. As Lee said, please check us out next time. I'm sure we'll have some great speakers, fantastic speakers this evening and also in the morning in the UK with Senator Malcolm Roberts. His website, which I was trying to pull up before I lost my screen, is Malcolm Roberts Queensland, so QLD.com.au, and you can follow Malcolm. As I said, social media as well. All our guests are across social media as well are we. And thank you for everyone that are watching this, and hopefully we can see you all next time for another global discussion forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you.